So moving on from what you said a little bit, I would say that vice has both an inward and outward component. It has an inward destructive component and an outward destructive component as well. And the inward one is obviously quite distinct to the outward one in that it's sort of unavoidable for there to be inward destruction, because by definition, if it is a vice, it is having some sort of detrimental effect upon your personal life in some way. And so that's unavoidable. But the outward component, people can simply avoid you, which again has inward consequences. But I'm not necessarily saying that that's desirable. I'm just saying that, you know, it's not quite as unavoidable as it could be. But obviously, if you have a vice, it's going to be detrimental to the people around you.
Yes.
And if you care about the people around you, which you should, it is not only irresponsible, it is also going to be very destructive to them. You could harm them, which will obviously make you feel very bad about yourself. And,
well, also, it's just, even if you don't have any direct consequences of harm, for example, if you get hooked on an addictive substance and you're not threatening to stab a family member for money to buy crack with, right? That's an extreme example. Even if it's not that, even if everyone has at least one family member who is not in a state of readiness when crisis strikes, you end up with the Fall of Rome meme with a smug soy jack superimposed in front of it saying, well, how does this affect you personally? Because it has a scaling issue, right? If you have the immediate consequences of detrimentally impacting your family because you're hooked on a vice, then one, it's hard to avoid a family member because of those inextricable sentimental bonds. You're born dependent. We're all in units. It's difficult to break.
By definition, having a dependency makes you less adaptable because you are dependent on something. I mean, there are things that we are dependent on that we can't avoid. Like for the pedants in the comments, yes, I'm dependent on drinking water and eating food. You know, that is a dependency, but that is, you know, one of the feasible things of being a material being, right?
Yeah, but I mean the non-material aspect of being. I mean the fact that you are enmeshed in a family dynamic, even if that family dynamic is adverse, abusive, or that you want to cut someone out, it's still painful to do so. And just look at San Francisco, for example. The amount of people that you have to step over on the pavement that are dying of drug addiction over time does build up the alienation factor, does contribute to social decay. So yeah, there is an element of avoidability as long as it's confined to one tramp per town who's a bit of a drunk. But if the costs of vice are diminished culturally and materially, then it incentivizes people that aren't quite as cognizant of the moral dimensions of vice to just become addicted to it. And that does have a social contagion effect, which erodes the social fabric.
As someone who lives in Swindon, I'm well aware of the environmental effects of crackheads ruining everything.
Yeah, fair point.
In fact, just the mere mention of them makes me sneeze in an allergic response. I'm just that much of a snob. So the behaviour of, say, vice, if you will, can take three different forms which vary in severity. And these are things that are reflected in the literature, but I've kind of put my own sort of spin on it, if you will, but that is not too out there necessarily. So there's excess, which is things like risk-taking, gambling, some substance abuse, sexual promiscuity, that I think is fair to label them as excessive because they're beyond the realm of normal behavioural function. It's suggesting there's some sort of maladaptive reason to be going towards those things, more so than might seem healthy, but it hasn't got to the point where there's necessarily explicit and obvious negative side effects yet. And we're going to be talking about excess a bit later, but first we're going to be tackling addiction, which is supposedly the most severe. I would say that's pretty self-evident, really, and that's of course again substance abuse, but in a more severe state. You can be addicted to video games, although I have covered that before and have said many positive things about it. Pornography, and pretty much anything that acts on the neural reward system. So you can become sort of addicted to running, for example, because that has a neurochemical release. Although obviously being addicted to running and being addicted to heroin are not equal things. I know, it's such a bombshell. And the final one, which I'm going to call the biblical vices, things like greed, lust, envy, lying, cheating, that sort of thing. That's more akin to moral vices, personal
character defects. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've kind of tacked these on at the end because some people may label these vices, some people may not. They may see them as independent things. But I thought I'd include them just to be thorough, although they're not necessarily going to be the focus, because I think these are virtues or lack thereof. And so I think looking at them with a slightly different lens might be warranted. But first, I suppose it's worthwhile pointing out the work that I've done so far. You feature in a couple of these, actually. So I've done a couple of contemplations tackling this sort of thing. Are we a civilization of drug addicts? Where me and you looked at various common things like prescription opiates and the contraceptive pill and all the things that we've become dependent on as a civilization and how they're detrimentally affecting us. And I think the term drug addicts is fair because, of course, you can't necessarily get addicted to, say, the contraceptive pill, but our society is dependent upon its use, at least in its current state. Not saying that it's good, but I'm saying that people rely on it, which shouldn't be a controversial statement. And then we also have, if I can use a mouse properly, this one here, which is, again, mine and yours, the psychology and morality of pornography, where we're talking about that sort of thing and explaining why it might be detrimental to both you and other people around you. And although we came down on different sides about whether it should be banned or not, we agreed on the detrimental effects.
Yes.
And then finally, this is one I did with Harry, are video games bad for you? And basically my premise was, if you're addicted to them, yes. And if not, they can actually be quite good for you, depending on what kind of game, because people like to lump games all in together. But you'll have to find out which distinctions I made in this Contemplations. I mean, I'm plugging it, but of course, you're already watching this, so you may well have watched them already. But it's just worthwhile to remind you of the kind of things I've kind of built off of to talk about this. So I'm going to talk about addiction now. And again, as I said before, this is probably one of the most pervasive forms of vice. People often euphemistically refer to it as a habit, and I think that is kind of getting to the core of it, is that it's something that you do repeatedly. It's something that cannot be shaked, and so it has that sort of habitual character. And I know that Aristotle said that virtue is basically habit forming, which I agree with. He's right to say so. Then vice must be sort of the inverse of that, in a sense. You're habituating a bad pattern of behaviour rather than a good one in virtue.
Yeah, so to link the biblical vices with vices that are reliance on certain substances or behaviours, I would say that the behaviours or substances are the enabling condition to put you in a moral deficit, like a inhibited state of readiness for that crisis which strikes, because certain vices like gambling, drinking, pornography, hard drugs, they do have an addictive element, and so they can reformat your brain chemistry. And
I will be touching on that soon.
Yeah, and so weaken your defenses against succumbing to certain underlying character flaws which draw you to that substance in the first place. So the mouth pleasure of fast food, for example, makes greed a hell of a lot easier to do, but you have to have been greedy as a prerequisite motivation. Otherwise, you wouldn't be indulging in all that food. It does just because there is that adverse psychological effect doesn't morally exculpate you from overindulging in that thing in the first place. Does that make sense?
Sure. I mean, to kind of steel man your example here, there's a guy who looks a bit like John Lennon, weirdly enough, who eats nothing but Big Macs for the past 20 years. And he's not fat. In fact, he's quite skinny, actually, because he only has 2 a day, and that's his food. And I mean, that's really weird, but, you know, it's a sign that you can go to McDonald's every day and not be a great big fat person. To accidentally quote Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs. So there is a sort of sweet spot, if you will. You can have fast food every now and then, and it's not going to kill you. It's not really going to do too much harm, but it's about being cognizant of the effect it's having upon yourself. I think that's the main thing I want to draw home, is that just be reflective on what's going on in your life. And with an addiction, sometimes it's very difficult to tell when it passes from sort of excess to an actual addiction. Like, I've been addicted to caffeine before, and I didn't really realise it. I would just have a habit of having a morning coffee, and sometimes I'd be irritable because I enjoyed my morning coffee when I didn't have it. And I just presumed, well, this is the nice thing, this is my treat for going through the boring old morning routine. And then I realised, oh yes, this is, all of the hallmarks of a sort of physical addiction.
I was actually, to come back on your final Contemplations blog example, I was addicted to games as a teenager. I got really good at first-person shooters. Like, I was
Call of Duty in particular.
I was unbelievably good at Call of Duty.
I was playing a lot of that when I was a teenager. I got in, I think at one point I was playing so much that I was in like the top 10,000 on Xbox Live in the world, which is very sad. That was for Team Deathmatch, which is really lame, and I'm ashamed to say it.
Yeah, I used to float in the semi-pro circles, made a little bit of money. I did Destiny raid runs. I did crap tons of Titanfall. I was near top 500 on the European servers for Overwatch for a bit. I was properly sweaty, and my social life deteriorated as a result. And so this is perhaps why I'm a bit more hardline on these things. It's that for certain people, there are certain things which are irresistible. It's like the monkeys that are genetically predisposed to alcoholism. Like, you don't know until you let the monkey drink. So sometimes, the occasional bag of McDonald's fries, I mean, seed oils, sure, but they aren't the worst thing in the world for you. But don't fill your life with things that degrade you and impede your progress as a person that other people can rely on. And also, there are certain things you don't need to try because it almost isn't worth the risk falling under their sway.
I hope you enjoyed that segment from Contemplations, my series. And if you want to watch the full conversation, which that was taken from, all you need to do is sign up to our website for £5 a month, and you can watch all of the content we have there. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.